Again, welcome and thank you so much for joining us this evening. I am very pleased to have our friends here from the Coastal Mountains Land Trust. We normally do this series of fall-winter talks at the Camden Public Library, but they have been gracious enough to agree to do them due to COVID-19 on Zoom with us this season. So once again, thank you so much for joining us here. And we'll be doing these on second Thursdays in the fall and winter. So we hope you come back again and learn more about what this important organization is doing. And tonight we are lucky to have the executive director of the organization, Ian Stewart, as well as the conservation projects manager, Jack Shaida. And they are going to tell us a little bit about a recent program that they completed that has to do with mapping the region to identify some of the most important areas for conservation. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to Ian.
Great. Thank you very much, Julia, and welcome everybody to a presentation that Jack and I have worked on for explaining what the Land Trust thinks are important priorities for additional conservation in the Western Penobscot Bay region. I guess I'll start just by saying how much we enjoy this work in terms of taking a long view of conservation, knowing that it's a very patient process to protect land. And this evening I will be presenting sort of a little bit of background, and then really going to turn it over to Jack Shaida, who did a terrific job pulling together a whole lot of data and input from people and organizations and partners to try to answer the question, where do we want to concentrate our efforts in the future for land conservation? I'll start just big picture though, that there is been a lot of discussion in ecological literature and even in the political sphere lately about how much of our earth we need to conserve in order to maintain biodiversity as we know it, to prevent climate change, and to foster the natural world moving forward. And E.O. Wilson has said that should be half of the earth. There's quite a movement politically now about trying to conserve 30% of the earth for native ecosystems to subsist. I think California, I just recently saw someone, the governor of California, committing to trying to conserve 30% of California. And while we're not looking for a fixed percentage in our land trust work, we are asking the question, if we're going to conserve enough to maintain the quality of place that we have and the natural ecosystems of our area, how do we map that, and how do we protect, how do we plan for conserving a large area of the coast? And so what we've done is done a very detailed study of the 15 towns that we work in to ask that question. Jack's going to be forwarding slides, so I'll wave my hand every once in a while when it's time for the next slide. But just quickly to give a little bit of background, I know many of you on the call, I'm sure, recognize some of the names, are quite familiar with us, but the Land Trust as an organization started in 1986 around conserving Beach Hill. And at that time, we were very much, it was a young organization, grassroots group of people responding to the need to protect something that was very threatened. So Beach Hill was being discussed for development. The organization was created to hold a conservation easement to protect that place. And that's terrific, but since then we've tried to move much beyond that to, rather than just responding to the threat of development, we've actually tried to be much more proactive and plan for conservation well ahead of some development proposal on a specific piece of land. And we've tried to plan for conservation of much larger scale properties. Go ahead, Jack. So we now have grown to an organization that works in 15 towns up and down Western Penobscot Bay, from Rockport all the way to Prospect. So if you drive all the way up to the bridge on the Penobscot River, that's the northern extent of our service region. And so it's a much larger area to plan for. We've conserved a lot of land in Camden and Rockport and Lincolnville, and are now, while there's still important priorities there, are also asking how to make a difference in all the communities we serve. I will pause to say I'm happy if you have questions as we go through here. Again, just to remind you, Julia was going to keep track of the chat room, and we'll be happy to incorporate questions as we go along. I guess the other thing I'll say is we've done several rounds of planning for conservation in the past. In the early 90s, there was conservation planning that identified the Duck Trap River as a conservation focus. And since then, if you look at this map, there's a lot of conservation that's happened along the Duck Trap. In the early 2000s, we identified Bald and Ragged Mountains in Camden, Rockport, and Hope as a priority. And much of that has been conserved. And we also identified the Passaic-Waukeg River area in Belfast, where the rail trail is. Just again, quick background. We conserve land in two primary ways. We buy land, or people make donations of land that we own, we call preserves, or we work with private landowners to complete conservation easements, which are restrictions that protect land in perpetuity. Hi, Jack. Just to say a brief thing about kind of what my personal motivation for land conservation is, in addition to wildlife and climate security and the many things that land conservation does. I really think one of the fundamental parts of conservation is protecting a sense of place and the quality of place. And certainly in this area of Maine, I was saying to someone today, there's a broad consensus that we live in a really special place that's worth conserving. This is a picture of a lagoon system in Washington State where I grew up, where my family used to go on long weekends, and my parents would sort of ditch me on this beach for the day. And it was a couple of years ago, I went to a land conservation conference, ran into someone in the hall who had just completed a conservation easement on this exact stretch of beach. So for me, it's just sort of a personal story of saying conservation has a lot of reasons, but for me, it's about protecting those places that we grow up and want to see stay the way they are for future generations to enjoy. So it was really meaningful for me to run into somebody in the hall of a conference and find out that this place I grew up had been conserved permanently. Okay, Jack. Just beyond conservation, in terms of acquiring land, the Land Trust is also very busy taking care of lands that we own. This is a project controlling knotweed in the Duck Trap, but we have many thousands of acres of land that we have many people involved in on a hands-on basis, taking care of, monitoring, maintaining boundaries, building trails, you name it. So there is a lot of active management of property. And then we also focus very heavily on connecting people with land. So in addition to stewardship, we were very interested in making sure that talking about it like we're doing tonight, but also inviting people out to for walks and talks and outings and all that sorts of things. So if you follow the organization, hopefully more and more you're seeing more and more invitations for things to get involved in, and for you and your family to get outdoors and enjoy the many places we've conserved. Next one, Jack. Yep. So just briefly, in terms of, I like to show this slide because many people kind of want to know, how can I do more with the Land Trust immediately? We are a membership organization and love people to become members. And as part of doing that, or even without doing that, you can visit our website or give us a call, and we're very happy to make information available about all of our trails. This is a screen capture of the trails information on our website. There is detailed information on the many trails that we manage. All members can get a new trail guide, which gives you descriptions of over 35 different preserves that we have open for people to enjoy. And then more importantly, as a member, we really love to have people involved in the organization, whether they volunteer or are joining committees or on the board eventually, that sort of thing. But we are a very open door organization and invite you to participate however you see fit. So as I said before, I kind of wanted to tee up in general sense the idea of conservation planning. Again, the question is, how do we decide where we want to conserve land in the future? I mentioned that we've done several rounds of conservation planning using technology and people to come together to ask that question. And if you look at this map again, what's happened as a result of planning to focus in certain areas is we've been able to achieve large contiguous areas of conservation. So again, the Duck Trap River, which is in the middle of this map, some conservation along the Passy, which is less, but still significant. And then of course, the Bald and Ragged Mountains area is probably the most significant, which, Jack, if you go to the next slide. This is a composite map of what was a focus area and continues to be a focus area in Bald and Ragged. The orange polygon is an area that we said to ourselves beginning in 2003, we want to see as much of that conserved as possible. And what's exciting about this map now is there's very little left, there's very little orange left, and it's almost all green. So there's been about 80% of this area has been conserved since 2003. And so what we're doing in our new process, which Jack will now talk about, is asking where are these other polygons that we want to try to conserve. And I'll just mention, if you haven't been out to the Round the Mountain and to the Bald and Ragged Mountains focus area recently, we have just done what we've called a soft opening of the Round the Mountain Trail, accessing via the Camden Snowbowl. Now you can hike 4.5 miles out through the land trust property and the properties on the water company lands. And it's currently an out and back trail because it's just a section of it that's open, but we're really excited to have that trail open. And if you need more information, give a call or go to the Snowbowl and start at the trailhead. And from there, I'm happy to introduce, here's a picture of the trail, just to give you a sense of its scale and accessibility. It's a really lovely, easy to follow path through the mountains. And with that, I'm happy to introduce Jack Shaida, who is our conservation projects manager, and as I said, has done a year and a half's worth of work facilitating our planning process moving forward.
Great, thank you, Ian. Yeah, I think Ian teed that up really nicely. I think one thing that helped me personally coming in and working on this project is I've been at the Land Trust for about 2.5 years now in various roles. I first interned at the Land Trust about 4 years ago now, but I've really only been in the mid-coast for 2.5 years. So I didn't know the area particularly well. I didn't have particular biases or feel like this one place or this one other place was the most important thing that the Land Trust had to work on, which in some ways I think was helpful because it meant I had to talk to a lot of people. I had to learn a lot of things, and I had to study the whole region to try to figure out where do we go from here. Just a bit of background, Ian's really already covered, but this map just shows where we started back in 1986 and then kind of where we've expanded to. So the Land Trust only had its current 5-town service region for about 8 years now. The last time we did a conservation plan before this was back in 2005 and then 2006. So we kind of needed to update it we started this process in 2018. Ian already described these. These were our past focus areas and regions of interest that have guided it. I think we both talked about Bald and Ragged, but that's just a slightly more up-to-date map with a little more green on it and showing, of course, the plan for the Round the Mountain Trail. But essentially, we're answering the question, what's most important? The Land Trust has limited funds, limited resources, limited time. We're in some ways in a race to kind of conserve land before it's developed, before some natural characters are lost. So this conservation plan is a work plan that identifies the most important areas for conservation. It's essentially an exercise in prioritization. So to start this process, we decided, well, what's important to us? As most of you know, our mission is to conserve land for the benefit of the human and natural communities of Western Penobscot Bay, of this region, which is just our way of saying we want to keep land in a natural state for everyone, for individuals who use it, for individuals who visit, who live nearby, both people, animals, plants. But we had to get a little more detailed about what it is that we wanted to conserve. And through discussion amongst our own board, we had a conservation planning committee that assisted with this, and as well as discussion and survey with our membership, we kind of narrowed down the attributes of land that we are looking to conserve. These are just some examples. Top left, you have Mirror Lake on next to Ragged Mountain, that has both lakes are very important, both in terms of scenic recreation purposes, but also for their ecology. Mountains as well are some of the more ecologically diverse areas in our region, as well as the most striking. Below that, deer habitat, Atlantic salmon habitat, which we conserved through our duck trap campaign, and then a vernal pool on the top right. Those are just some examples. We ended up picking 10 different, what we called criteria. So these were attributes of land that didn't necessarily cover everything, but they covered most of the important characteristics of land. So these are some examples. Does a given property, does a given area have a lake? Is it important wildlife habitat, both terrestrial or aquatic? And then once we had these criteria that we wanted to use, we went looking for data. And when we found data, we put it all together through a process called the suitability analysis. This is a very technical chart. It's not exactly what I did. I won't linger on it too long, but I'll draw your attention to the thing on the right that shows those 5 different layers stacked on top of each other. And then you get to the bottom right, and that's the suitability analysis itself. This is a planning tool that was developed in the 50s with kind of the advent of mapping technology. And it sounds a little complicated, but it's actually pretty straightforward. In this case, we are trying to find out what land should we conserve, but you could do this for all sorts of other things. You could do it, where do I want to build my school, or where do I want to build my house? You could use mapping to help identify that as well. You could also use it to predict or try to find out, where are key bits of habitat for a certain species. There are a lot of different applications for it. I have an example of perhaps the most impressive and wide-ranging suitability analysis done for conservation purposes. This is from research done by the Nature Conservancy's Eastern Sciences Division. And they were looking at, for the entire northeastern portion of the United States and Canada that you see on this map, what areas will be most resilient to climate change. And they built the suitability analysis in the same way that we did. So they took a whole bunch of different information, a bunch of geospatial data or GIS data. A lot of it is aerial photography, elevation geology data. They put it together, and through scientifically evaluated metrics, they essentially produced the suitability analysis that showed you what lands will be able to best retain their current characteristics in a world with 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And they produced this map for the entire northeastern part of the United States and Canada that they currently use to guide their conservation priorities. So that's just the biggest example I really came across. Going back a little bit, to build the suitability analysis, we gathered publicly available data. So we didn't produce any information ourselves. Any of you, if you had my documentation, could download the data off the internet, and with the right tools could reproduce our conservation plan. I primarily got it from these 4 organizations: USGS, US Fish and Wildlife Service, beginning with Habitat, which is a program of the state of Maine. That's actually first rolled out in 2003, but is program of the part of the Maine Natural Areas Program, and helped towns, conservation organizations, counties essentially take this kind of conservation planning and put it into their comprehensive planning, put it into their regional planning, economic development, or organizational planning. So a lot of other organizations and groups in Maine have been doing this for the last 15 years. And then the Nature Conservancy that I just mentioned, we also got data from them. So I got over 10 different data sources that I put into these 10 different maps that are component maps, that they're all quite small. If you're really interested, get in touch with me after, and we can talk more and look more at these maps in finer detail. But I'll just quickly go through an overview of all of them. And each of these maps represents some criteria or element of natural places that the land trust values. We base this on both our own biases and subjective views, but also on some scientific research saying, okay, what are important features for conserving biodiversity, for adapting to climate change, essentially for keeping natural ecosystems intact. So it's a combination of both our preferences, but it is based on some real research and real work that other organizations have done. So a set of these are kind of water features of lands. We have rivers, aquifers, wetlands, lakes. Another set are essentially the degree to which an area is developed. One of these that I'll talk about later, a little later, is undeveloped habitat blocks. Significant habitat, so the state does a lot of mapping around threatened, rare, and endangered species, as well as threatened, rare, and endangered habitat. So we incorporated that as well. And then we also incorporated some data about geology and topography that is suggestive of the long-term biodiversity and climate change resiliency of land. So just to give an example, this is the wetlands map that I developed. So we took data from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about the location and distribution of wetlands in our service region. And we essentially scored each wetland. So essentially based on its size, based on its ecological characteristics, we gave it a point score. And in this case, we gave it a score from 0 to 14, with 14 being the most important wetlands, the ones we really want to conserve, and 0 being lower on that scale. And I'll get back to why we did these points a little bit later, but each of those 10 maps I just showed had a different point scale. It was a somewhat arbitrary exercise, but we did it to be able to compare one area to another, even when those areas had kind of a different set of characteristics. Another example was undeveloped habitat blocks I just mentioned. This one I think is really cool and really crucial. So in this map, the really dark red, almost brown areas are the largest undeveloped habitat blocks, and they're all thank you for that quick mention. Ian just correctly pointed out that these last few maps are bigger than our service region. So you can see on it where my cursor is, that's our service region, 15 towns. But this highlighted area is actually a 25-town region. And the reason all of these maps cover an area of 25 towns, not just 15 towns, is because there's some really important, ecologically important areas on the edge of our service region. And as we all know, town boundaries are completely arbitrary. They don't necessarily correspond to natural features. So we didn't want to discount the importance of certain natural areas that were on the edge of our service regions just because they're close to, for an example, the Rockport, Rockland town line. There's Mount Pleasant there nearby Bald and Ragged Mountain. In past iterations of our conservation planning, it scored very poorly. In this version, it scored better because we were looking at the whole mountain, what was there naturally, not just the portion of the mountain in Rockport in our service region. So that was, sorry to go back on that. But this undeveloped habitats layer, which I think is really cool, essentially shows the size of an area that's undeveloped, that doesn't, it's in between roads. There aren't building structures, roads, industrial development, mining within them. Those are all excluded. And then areas that are in bigger undeveloped blocks get a higher score from 0 to 10, and areas that are in smaller or medium-sized blocks can get a 5 or a 6. So we took these layers and we then put them into these smaller data sets. So this is our habitat values data set. We have 3 of these. And this is showing areas that have kind of the most important habitat for, not for a single species, there are more particular maps for that, but for general biodiversity. So just to point out some different areas on this map, portions of the Camden Hills score very highly. Portions of the Duck Trap are actually the highest scoring areas in the map. And then in Waldo County, an area around Herds Pond was one of the higher scoring areas. So that was one example. Then we also made one for water features and landscape features. We then took those together. We combined the three of them. Imagine you're taking three pieces of somewhat transparent paper, laying them on top of each other. And as values align in the same area, they'll get brighter and brighter on the map. So that's where we ended up with the suitability analysis. I think I have a bigger version on the next slide. So this was kind of what we're going for, the suitability analysis map. This shows you which areas the land trust should pursue conservation of. Areas in darker red are the most important than areas in lighter colors, less so. This map in some ways is a reverse map of the development of our area. It makes sense. We don't want to conserve already developed areas or small woodlots near developed areas. So large portions of Belfast, Camden, Searsport near Route 1, Stockton Springs, Rockport along Route 1 are very low scoring, while some completely unsurprising areas, the Camden Hills, the Duck Trap, Bald and Ragged, are very high scoring, but as well as a bunch of areas that we haven't done as much conservation of were also very high scoring as well. So we took that map and we used it to make areas of interest. And this is essentially 20 areas. They're all large-scale habitats. If we conserved any of them in their entirety, we believe that they would stand on their own in perpetuity as kind of an intact ecosystem. So that's where they're chosen. Some of these are almost entirely conserved. So we picked these areas irrespective of their conservation. The Camden Hills is the most notable. It's almost completely conserved, over 90% conserved. We probably aren't going to start a great big project to conserve the last 10 parcels in the Camden Hills, but we chose these areas irrespective of their levels of conservation to show that the ecology, the natural values stand on their own. As you can see, there's kind of a cluster around the Camden Hills down here in Knox County, and then there's a cluster north of Belfast in Waldo County. And this was the result of the conservation plan. It was not my job to pick what the land trust was going to focus on in the near term. This is essentially a menu of options for conservation. That this then got turned over to our board of directors as they're creating a new strategic plan, which we finished recently, last April. That will guide the organization for a 5-year period from 2020 to 2025. And in that, we have 3 different ways of conserving land. One is through focus areas, which I will talk about first. Then is through community conservation. And lastly is independent projects. So that's just if someone calls us on the phone, tells us that they have a property they'd like to see conserved, we'll still talk to them and work on that project if it's possible, as long as it doesn't take away from our work on focus areas and community projects. So this is the focus area map that we have for the next 5 years. If you remember the map I showed a few minutes ago of our past ones, this is much more sparse, and that's because this is for a shorter time span. There are 4 areas: Bald and Ragged, the Duck Trap, which we've talked about a lot, and those areas, they're more finishing projects, where in this next 5 years, we're really hoping to kind of wrap up the conservation in those areas. Herds Pond and Mount Tuck, Herds Pond being in Belfast and Swanville, Mount Tuck being in Stockton Springs and Prospect, are kind of newer projects that we hope to be working on within these 5 years, but potentially beyond them, because they're very important. So I'll talk about them one at a time. This is Hurd's Pond. If you haven't been, it is an incredibly diverse wetland lake system. It's just north of Belfast if you take City Point Road out of town. Incredibly wonderful area. This year there was a nesting pair of sandhill cranes on the pond. I think that's public knowledge now. It's on eBird. I don't think they're there anymore. Who knows if they'll come back, but maybe go there next spring to look for them. This is a map of the Hurd's Pond area. As you can see, there's already some significant conservation there. The Land Trust owns 3 parcels. It's now actually 5 parcels. We conserved 2 more this summer. And then Inland Fisheries and Wildlife have a parcel down here. So this map it says less about the features of the land and is more strategic. It's saying where the Land Trust wants to focus in the near term. And so we have a plan for how we're going to reach out, talk with, and work with landowners to try to conserve the areas we think are most important, as well as raise money for conservation, where we have a willing partner who can only sell the property to us, that we can't do a donation. So these maps help us raise funds for that. The other area is Mount Tuck. This is a drone photo. Mount Tuck is right here in the middle. It's approximately 600-foot tall mountain. It is right, that is from the top of Mount Tuck looking south. It's at the head of Penobscot Bay where the Penobscot River is. It is the mountain or hill that's on your left as you're driving up Route 1 and you're about to get to the bridge. So you've all probably seen it a number of times, but never really thought much of it. This is the mountain itself. We acquired the summit piece last year, and we are working on conserving more pieces this year. And this is kind of the focus area. I didn't explain it with the last map, is orange. These are areas that we are working hardest to conserve, while the yellow is our areas of interest that we are still working to conserve, but they're not our highest top priorities. Then the other types of conservation we're trying to do in this 5-year period is community conservation. And that's because when we asked ourselves what's important, trails and proximity were very important. So even though the most spectacular, the most ecologically important properties are in the duck trap in the Camden Hills, or in the Passy Lakes near Hurd's Pond, a little bit outside of town, a place you drive to and visit, you know, a 1-acre patch of woods can be tremendously important to a huge number of people, especially to young people during their development. I know I grew up in suburban New York, and there were 50 trees behind my house, and I've probably spent cumulative years of my life wandering those 50 trees and looking at the ecology and looking at the leaves and watching chipmunks. And that patch of woods is really nothing in terms of a large-scale ecological purpose, but had an enormous impact on my development. And the Land Trust as a whole has recognized that we need to conserve and make available natural spaces close to people that are easy to get to. And conserving lands close to schools is very important. And I think COVID has shown the importance of that more so than ever, where kids are having to get outside because of COVID-19. Our hope is that when forced to get outside this year, many students, teachers, parents will learn that outdoor education's a truly wonderful thing. And this year, we haven't done any conservation, but we've worked with various schools in our service region to build outdoor classrooms, like this one in the middle, that is just a series of stumps that the kids can sit on to help them get outside. The other thing that's very important are trails. I assume all of you, or most of you, love trails if you're in this talk. And some really fantastic trails aren't in the middle of the woods. They're not going to a river. I think one of our most popular projects ever is the Belfast Rail Trail here on the center left. This was our 5K from 3 years ago, where we had over 150 people come. The rail trail has never been more popular than it's ever been before. I think I can safely say that trails in this area have never been more popular. Sometimes frighteningly so, with the amount of people who are trying to get outside because of COVID. And that just shows that the need for trails, the need for accessible places for our physical and mental health is kind of more important than ever. So we just wanted to incorporate those types of projects, set aside some resources for them, both staff time and potential acquisition resources, because they're incredibly important to our community. So that's kind of my quick brush through. I think I'm ready to open it up for questions, unless Ian, you want to jump in and add anything back at the end.
So at this time, I encourage anyone, if you have questions, to please go ahead and use the chat box. You can type your question into the chat box and we'll make sure to read it aloud so everyone else can hear. Thank you, Ian and Jack, for that wonderful and very comprehensive presentation. I am so glad that you mentioned the community projects, because I was getting a little concerned the way you were talking about these large swaths of land being the priority. And some of my favorite things, some of my favorite Coastal Mountains Land Trust properties are the smaller ones, like Harkness, and you do such a fantastic job preserving those places, and they're very special to me and my family. So I was thrilled to hear that that's still on the agenda. While we wait to see if anyone has any questions, I would love for you to talk a little bit more about what happens after you've identified a particular piece of land, not when someone comes to you immediately to donate it, but once after doing such an extensive study as you did with this mapping project, what are the next steps you take to start to acquire that land? And what are the resources you need to do that?
So it depends a little bit on the area, but I think this really helps develop, what the properties are, who the landowners are. And we really start with, talking to our friends and supporters, members of the community who know those areas really well, who know those landowners really well. In the case of Heard's Pond, we have one of our board members and supporters lives near the area. He knows everyone along the pond in that area. So we talk with him and kind of other folks in the community, get a sense of, okay, how do these other landowners feel about conservation? What's their ethic regarding the land? I don't necessarily mean ethic, but their usage pattern. We find that particularly if someone lives here, almost everyone who lives in this region really cares for the land. They love the land. So everyone shares that value with us. And then from there, we begin reaching out. Sometimes we can get an introduction just for a phone call, face-to-face meeting. In some cases, we've written letters to everyone in the focus area, just saying, this is what we're working on. This is what we want to do. We'd love for you to join us. All the landowners we work with them confidentially. We work with them voluntarily. So it's really important to make our case, build that trust. Sometimes those projects can take 20 years. Sometimes they're much faster. But that's from here. It's building relationships with the landowners and with people in the community. And Ian could talk more about the fundraising side of that. I luckily don't do too much of that, but.
Yeah, but I do think Jack's right. It's getting to know the community and building relationships with landowners. And the message isn't what's interesting about conservation is that there are lots of options. There's ways that landowners can continue to own their land and pass it on to future generations, but still see it conserved. Or in some cases, they'll give or sell a portion of their land to us that they understand is really significant and keep. So every project becomes a creative exercise of what are the landowners' goals, what are ours, and how do we fit together. And briefly on funding, largely with the beginning of focus areas, we're looking for grants and foundations to help us get started. As we get in the Mount Tuck, we have one piece now, and now there's 3 more that are coming as possibilities. So we're putting together a longer vision for raising money from a broader group, but foundations and some public funding has helped us get started.
Do you ever find that you are working with the state, with their land, or with other land trusts in order to kind of, acquire spaces that you would like the Coastal Mountains Land Trust to manage? I mean, does the state ever come into play?
Yeah, I think we had 2 or 3 meetings this week with different state agencies about possible pieces of property. And we may raise money, we may help make something happen that the state ends up owning. It's not all about us owning land in the end. For example, I think there's been 7 additions to Camden Hills State Park over the years that we helped make happen, but are part of Camden Hills Park.
And the same is true with the towns and other nonprofit organizations, Maine Coast Heritage Trust, Georges River Land Trust being other nonprofits. And then we worked extensively with the town of Camden and the town of Belfast. I mean, we call it, we worked with them on the city, the city of Belfast, on the rail trail and a lot of other conservation projects there. So having those organizational partnerships is very important.
No, it sounds like I'm just astonished looking again at your maps, the vast quantities of land that you manage now. It must take so many people and so many volunteers. Can you talk just real quickly about the volunteers that work with your program, and are you looking actively for volunteers for your program?
Sure. We've always been an organization that's been driven largely by volunteer effort, whether it's on committees and on the board, but even more so out in the field doing hands-on stuff. This year has been a little funny with COVID because we've had to be a little more careful with how many people get together at once.
Sure. Yeah.
But I would think come spring we'll be pivoting again to really wanting to recruit pretty actively. People are always welcome, but I think spring is probably our best time. We have about 225 people who are involved in some aspect of volunteering with the organization. And I think the classic one is to be a preserve steward, where you are given an individual piece of land that you keep an eye on throughout the year, walk the trails, walk the boundaries, and just are kind of the eyes and ears of the organization to let us know if there's something amiss that we need to know about.
Excellent. I think that's a question I've had in the past is how can people help, and do they have to be specialists in ecology or biology or something like that, or are you're just looking for grunt work too, someone to help dig the trails and move the rocks?
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. There's a lot of that. And what I like about the Stewards program is people can do it on their own time, so you can go out when it's convenient for you. But then we also have weekly work days. So if you want to join a group of people doing trail work or invasive plant work, that's possible.
Well, it looks like we did have one question come in. It says, how do or did you consider adjacency to existing conserved lands, and or what might be considered low-hanging fruit?
Sure. So in there's actually a whole nother part of this conservation plan, a set of evaluation criteria that I didn't talk about in this presentation, just to keep it simple. But we considered adjacency to existing conservation land there. We did not conserve it in and of itself in those series of maps that I showed earlier. And we thought about and discussed it. And the reason we didn't is because we felt that areas that had adjacency to conserved land would reflect that in terms of some of the other data sets. So we didn't want to double count. And then in terms of individual parcels that we might consider low-hanging fruit or key connections in holding, for instance, if it was in a focus area, it would kind of be the top priority of that focus area. If it wasn't in the focus area, then we would kind of evaluate it separately as an independent project using that criteria that I just mentioned before.
Thank you, Jack. Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions coming in. And you know what? I forgot to put on my hat, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now. So I don't know if anyone can even see me, but I've got my Coastal Mountains Land Trust hat on. And gentlemen, I thank you so much for being here with us this evening. And again, folks, I wanted to remind you that on second Thursdays in the fall and in the winter, we're going to be hosting the Coastal Mountains Land Trust for various talks. So please check our website and theirs. You can find our website at librarycamden.org, and we'll be posting all of the programs that they're doing as well as others. And you all are welcome to all of our programs. So just send me an email and I'll send you a Zoom link. Once again, we've recorded this and we'll be placing it on the Camden Public Library Programs YouTube channel if you know anyone who'd like to watch it afterwards. All right. So once again, Ian and Jack, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank
Hey,
you.
thank you so much, Julia.
All right. See ya. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.